Today is Thursday, July 20. I'm Pastor Anthony, and this is Wilderness Wanderings. Today our text comes from 1 Kings 12. 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, as the king had said, "Come back to me in 3 days." The king, that is Rehoboam, answered the people harshly. Rejecting the advice given him by the elders, he followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father," that is Solomon, "made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam son of Nebat through Ahijah the Shilonite. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So the Israelites went home. It's 1 Kings 12, verses 12 through 16. I am still hung up on the theme of growing up to maturity in Christ. Paul uses this image a few times in the New Testament, fretting over his congregations that were still too immature to eat the solid food of the faith, but could only receive milk as infants. How he longed for them to grow up into the fullness of Christ. You can see this thread in passages like 1 Corinthians 3, verses 1 through 4, Galatians 4, verses 19 and 20, Ephesians 4, 11 through 16, or Hebrews 5, 11 through 14. Jesus once declared that every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. Paul was such a teacher who became a disciple, and some of the old treasures he brings out of his storeroom through his letters are images that come from deep reflection on the Old Testament scriptures. This theme of maturity is one of them, I think. I've noticed it most recently in places like 1 Samuel 2. There's a devotion and a sermon on that text you can find a link for in the notes. But I also see it here in 1 Kings 12. Of course, in a number of other places too. But for today, in 1 Kings 12, there's 3 times in this longer passage where King Solomon's son, Rehoboam, is said to have listened to the advice of the young men he grew up with, rather than the advice of the elders. Interestingly, neither King Rehoboam nor those men he grew up with would have been understood in that day to have been young. 1 Kings 14, verse 21 says Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king. Given the life expectancy of the day, he was certainly no spring chicken. Besides, the word for young men employed here in the Hebrew is a word which is translated in most other places in the Old Testament as child or boy. The reference, therefore, seems to be to the immaturity of these men rather than their age. Interestingly, the only use of this word for child or young man before this in the book of Kings is from the story of Solomon's wise judgment, when he said to 2 prostitutes fighting over a living baby, "Cut the living child in 2, and give half to one and half to the other." The word child is the word that's the same. Of course, after Solomon said this, the true mother backed off of her claim to the child, saying, "Please, my lord, give this other woman the living baby, don't kill him." While the other woman exclaimed, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Go ahead, cut him in 2. Somehow, the story of the living child being cut in 2 is evoked in the telling of Rehoboam's immaturity. I think the author means to suggest that the words of Solomon's own ruling have come back as a judgment against his own house. The rabbis said that Solomon was the worst of the kings of Israel because he was the one who caused the division of the nation that's depicted in this text today. And he did so through his sins of promiscuous marriage and idolatry. Israel as a nation is depicted often as an unfaithful spouse that prostitutes itself after all sorts of other gods besides the Lord. Solomon, though, was the first such idolatrous prostitute among the kings. Immature, despite his wisdom, his heart was divided among many dead scraps of religion, rather than wholeheartedly devoted to the living God. The fruit then of Solomon's house and Solomon's idolatrous prostitution, as embodied in Rehoboam, is a violent immaturity that results in the cutting of God's people in two. It's a similar violence to that of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and the Israelites were never to go back that way again. This is also the same violent immaturity displayed in the prostitute who is not the true mother of the child. The result of all this is a fatal wound that would eventually culminate in the death of both Israelite kingdoms through exile. Immaturity leads to idolatry, to violence, to division. It leads to the destruction of faith and of life itself. The invitation, therefore, is to grow up into Christ, to become maturity, to choose the path of life and of faith in the living God. The prophet Samuel, King David, Jesus himself all offer examples of what this growing up to maturity looks like, as do things like the fruit of the Spirit. But today's devotion is long enough, so more on that to come. For now, as you journey on into maturity in Christ, remember that you go with God's blessing. So may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you, wherever he may send you. May he guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storm. May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders he has shown you, and may he bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors.